The sun hung low over the dusty hills of a small village nestled between two rivers, their waters brown and slow, winding through the earth like veins through a body. Life here was simple, steady, a rhythm carved into the land over generations. Women braided each other's hair in the late afternoon light, children played in the streets, and men gathered at the town square, discussing everything and nothing. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of hay and earth. It was the kind of place where time moved like the slow, deliberate flow of the river, steady, unhurried, and quiet. But, as the world outside began to change, the quiet started to break. Slowly, at first, the cracks were so small that no one could see them. They were just whispers carried by the wind. But as the whispers grew louder, they became something undeniable, something impossible to ignore. Anya stood by the window in the small room she had grown up in, staring out over the village. The light from the setting sun bathed everything in golden hues, but it wasn't enough to ease the knot that had settled in her chest. The world outside her small village was changing, and she could feel it even if no one spoke of it aloud. People were beginning to talk about the rumors of soldiers marching across the borders, of a war that seemed to grow larger with every passing day. The leaders, those in charge, they spoke of peace. But the words they said didn't feel like peace. They felt like something far more dangerous. They felt like a storm gathering just over the horizon. She had grown up in this village, in a world where the most dangerous thing was the occasional wild animal or a bad harvest. War had never touched their lives, but Anya was no fool. She wasn't blind to the things that had begun to seep into the edges of their lives. Soldiers started passing through, their uniforms dirty from the road, their faces cold and unreadable, and every time one of them came into the village, Anya felt a tightening in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, but also something else, something like a loss she couldn't explain. Her father, Mikhail, was a man of few words, and Anya had inherited that quiet demeanor from him. She rarely asked questions that weren't necessary, and when she did, it was always with caution. But now, the questions seemed to fill her every waking moment. Why had they not told her what was happening? Why did the soldiers look at the town like it was a place they would soon have to leave? Why had the villagers stopped looking each other in the eye? She pulled away from the window and moved into the kitchen, where her mother was kneading dough. The steady rhythm of her hands as they pressed and folded the bread was a comfort, a sign that some things had not yet changed. Anya set the table in silence, the questions swirling in her mind like smoke. Her mother glanced up at her, but Anya said nothing, not yet sure how to voice the questions that seemed to tighten around her throat. Her mother's voice, calm and steady, as always, broke the silence. "You've heard the rumors, haven't you, Anya?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the dough as she shaped it into loaves. Anya nodded, though she had no intention of speaking. She didn't need to. Her mother's gaze told her everything she needed to know. The quiet was no longer something they could live with. It was as though they had been holding their breath for weeks, and now it was time to exhale. "I've heard the whispers," her mother continued, her voice low, as if sharing a secret. "There are those who say the war is already here. It may be distant now, but it won't be for long. We can only hope it doesn't come here." Anya felt a chill run through her. Her mother had always been the strong one, the one who kept the family grounded in the worst of times. But now there was a weariness in her voice, an uncertainty that Anya had never heard before. "Do you think it will come?" Anya asked, her voice small, despite herself. Her mother stopped kneading the dough, her hands resting lightly on the table. She met Anya's gaze, her eyes reflecting something that felt far older than the quiet village life they had known. "War changes everything, Anya," her mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You never see it coming until it's too late." Anya didn't reply. She had no words for the fear that was beginning to grip her. She had never been the one to worry, the one to fear the unknown. But now, it was as if the very air they breathed had shifted, had turned from something safe to something dangerous. They sat down to dinner in silence. The food was the same as it always was, simple, nourishing, a reminder of the life they had built here. But tonight, even the bread seemed heavier. The quiet was louder than it had ever been, and it pressed down on Anya's chest, as though the weight of the world was beginning to crush her from all sides. Her father had yet to speak, but she could see the way his hands trembled ever so slightly as he held his glass of water. It wasn't something he would show, not to her mother, not to anyone, but she could see it, and it frightened her more than she would have liked to admit. Finally, as they finished the meal, her father stood up and walked to the door. He didn't say a word, but Anya knew where he was going. He was going to the village square to listen to the men talk, to listen to the rumors, to hear if there were any answers. Anya followed him outside, her heart pounding in her chest. The sky was a bruised purple as the last remnants of sunlight faded away, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The village was quiet now, the sound of the river flowing distant in the background. Her father stopped by the well, his back turned to her. "Do you think it's true?" Anya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father turned, his eyes searching hers for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, his face grim. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I don't think we'll be able to avoid it forever." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Anya felt something inside her break. Not with fear, not yet, but with a deeper sense of loss. It wasn't just the village that was changing. It was the world itself, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. The days following her father's quiet admission passed like a dream, in slow motion, each one heavier than the last. Anya's mind felt clouded, as if the world she had once known was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to hold it back. The village, once a place of safety, now seemed like a fragile shell, teetering on the edge of something far darker. Every glance between the villagers felt like a secret they were all too afraid to speak aloud, and the air hung thick with the weight of things left unsaid. The sounds of everyday life, the laughter of children, the clinking of dishes, the comforting smell of bread baking in the oven no longer felt like comfort. They felt like the last remnants of a world that was already gone. Anya walked through the village square with her head held low, avoiding the eyes of the men who had once greeted her with smiles. They no longer smiled. Instead, they whispered among themselves, their words too quiet to hear but too heavy to ignore. Mikhail, her father, continued to disappear into the village square each night, staying longer and longer as the days stretched into weeks. Anya no longer questioned where he went. She knew there was only one thing that mattered now: the talk of soldiers, of war, of how close the front lines were, inching toward them. Each time he returned, his face was more drawn, his steps more hesitant, as though the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. Her mother, always strong, always steady, seemed to be holding the family together with an invisible thread, though Anya could see the cracks beginning to form in her resolve. Her mother's hands shook ever so slightly when she set the table, her movements careful, deliberate, as if she were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. One evening, as Anya helped her mother in the kitchen, the silence between them felt unbearable. Her mother was chopping vegetables, her knife tapping against the wooden cutting board with a rhythmic precision. It was the only sound in the room, and yet it seemed to echo in Anya's chest. Finally, Anya couldn't take it anymore. She had to know. She had to hear the truth, even if it was a truth that would change everything. "Mother," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "what do you think will happen?" Her mother paused for a moment, the knife hovering over the vegetables, before she lowered it onto the cutting board. She turned to face Anya, her eyes deep and tired, as though the weight of her own thoughts had worn her down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing more to say. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice steady but low. "We're on the edge of something, Anya," she said, her eyes distant. "I don't know what it is, but I can feel it. People are talking about it in hushed voices, as if the more they say it, the more real it becomes. But what if it is real?" She shook her head, as if trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. What if it's already too late? Anya's heart sank. She had known, deep down, that her mother had felt it too. They were all standing at the edge, waiting for something to push them over. And when it came, they would have no choice but to fall. The next day, the sky was overcast, as though the clouds themselves were holding their breath. Anya stepped outside, her eyes drawn to the horizon, where the village's simple homes stretched toward the fields. She had always found peace in the fields, the golden waves of wheat, the soft whisper of the wind. But today, the fields seemed barren, stripped of the life she had always known. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and anticipation. As she walked toward the river, she saw the first signs of the soldiers. They weren't in uniform yet, not fully, but there were too many of them to be civilians. too many of them with a purpose that Anya couldn't quite understand. They moved through the village with an air of urgency, their eyes scanning every face, every corner. They had arrived, and they were not leaving. Anya felt a chill run down her spine as one of the soldiers caught her gaze. His eyes were cold, distant, as though he had already seen too much. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Anya felt a surge of something she hadn't expected: fear. It wasn't the kind of fear she had known before. It wasn't the fear of storms or wild animals or the unknown. This was something different. This was the fear of seeing the future unfold before her, a future she had no control over. As the soldier turned and walked away, Anya's breath caught in her throat. The weight of what was coming seemed to press down on her chest, suffocating her. She knew, deep in her bones, that this was the moment everything changed. It was no longer a question of if the war would reach them. It was a question of when. She turned and walked back toward the village, her heart heavy. Her father was waiting for her at the door, his face worn with the weight of the world. He didn't need to say anything. His silence spoke volumes. It was a silence full of fear, of regret, and of something more, something that Anya didn't have the words for. "Father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what are we going to do?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, crumpled and torn. He handed it to Anya, and as she unfolded it, she saw the words written in neat, deliberate script: "The soldiers are coming. There is no more time." Anya's heart skipped a beat. The words were clear, direct. The war was coming for them, and there was no more time to wait, to prepare, to make sense of it. They had no choice but to face it head on, whether they were ready or not. She looked at her father, her eyes searching his face for something, anything that would give her hope. But all she saw was the same uncertainty that had taken root in her own heart. "We can't run," her father said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "There's no place to run anymore. We stay, we fight, and we survive." But as he spoke, Anya couldn't shake the feeling that survival wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to just survive. She needed something more, something to hold on to in the storm that was coming. The village had always been a place of quiet endurance, a place where everything, from the first light of day to the last flicker of dusk, seemed to move in its own rhythm. The people here had lived in harmony with the land, their lives shaped by seasons, their work shaped by the rhythms of the earth. They had known hardship, but it was the kind of hardship that came with growing things, the slow, patient labor of planting seeds and tending to crops, of raising children and watching them grow. War was something that happened to other people, far away. It was a distant story told by travelers, a nightmare that seemed too far from their doorsteps to touch. Now, that distant nightmare had come too close, and in its wake, the village was beginning to change. The soldiers came on horseback, their boots kicking up dust as they rode through the narrow streets, their eyes hard, their faces set in grim determination. They did not stop to talk to anyone. They moved with purpose, with authority, as though they owned the place. Their horses snorted in the heat, their hooves clattering against the cobblestone streets. And with every step they took, the village seemed to shrink a little more. Anya stood at the edge of the square, watching them. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know why she felt so exposed. She wasn't one to be afraid of soldiers. She had seen them before, passing through the village on their way to some distant front, their faces blank, their eyes hardened by things they had seen and done. But this time, it was different. This time, they were here to stay. As the soldiers rode through the square, Anya noticed something she had never seen before. The villagers were silent. Not a word was spoken. No greetings, no questions, no curiosity. They stood in place, their heads down, as if the soldiers were a force of nature, something too powerful to be questioned. Anya's father stood by the well, his eyes locked on the soldiers, his face pale and tight. His gaze flicked toward Anya for a moment, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. She could see it in his eyes, the fear, the resignation, the knowledge that the world they had known was over. The soldiers dismounted at the center of the square, and one of them, a tall man with dark hair and a scar running down his cheek, walked toward the mayor's house. The others spread out, taking their positions at key points in the village. They were settling in, marking their territory. The village was no longer theirs. It was the soldiers now. Anya's feet moved of their own accord. She couldn't stay still. She had to know what was happening. She had to see it with her own eyes. She followed the soldier with the scar as he entered the mayor's house, her heart hammering in her chest. She stayed hidden behind the stone walls of a nearby building, peering around the corner, hoping not to be seen. She didn't know what she was expecting. She only knew that she had to understand. Inside the mayor's house, the soldiers spoke with the mayor, their voices low but heated. Anya couldn't hear everything, but she could hear enough. The soldier was demanding food, supplies, and shelter for the men under his command. The mayor hesitated, but the soldier's tone left no room for negotiation. There was a threat in the air, unspoken but clear. As the soldier turned and exited the house, Anya pulled back into the shadows. She didn't want him to see her. She didn't want to be noticed. She could feel the tension tightening in her chest, the uncertainty growing like a storm cloud. The soldiers were here for more than just supplies. They were here to take control. And if they were going to take control, there would be no going back. The next few days were filled with tension. The soldiers made themselves known at every turn, occupying key spots around the village, setting up posts, keeping watch over the townspeople. The villagers, too afraid to speak out, went about their work with heads down, their voices hushed. No one dared to challenge the soldiers. No one dared to question their presence. They were here now, and the village had to accept it. Anya's family continued to live as though nothing had changed. Her mother went to the market. Her father tended to the fields, and Anya, still feeling the weight of fear and uncertainty, tried to keep herself busy with simple tasks. But nothing felt simple anymore. The weight of the world was pressing down on them, and she could feel it in her bones. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the fields, Anya stood by the river, looking out over the water. It was the one place where she still felt some semblance of peace, though it, too, seemed to have changed. The river no longer looked like a calm, endless flow of life. It felt like a boundary, a line separating the world they had known from the one they were now entering. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see her father standing a few paces away, his expression as unreadable as always. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching the river, as if lost in his own thoughts. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "Anya," he said, his voice low, "we can't stay here much longer." Anya's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he meant. The village was no longer a safe place. It hadn't been for some time. The soldiers had made that clear. But where would we go? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Where could we go? Her father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the horizon, his face etched with worry. "I don't know," he said finally. "But we can't wait for the storm to come to us. We need to make a choice." And thoughts swirled. She had no answer. She didn't even know if there was an answer. Everything had changed, and she was left trying to make sense of it all. "Do you think we can survive this?" she asked, her voice small, uncertain. Her father didn't look at her as he answered. He was staring into the distance, his face tired and drawn. "I don't know," he said softly. "But I know we have to try." The days following her father's quiet admission were filled with a kind of suspended time, where everything around Anya felt both immediate and distant at once. It was as though the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for something that no one had the courage to name. The soldiers' presence in the village was no longer a rumor or a passing moment. It was a reality that seeped into every conversation, into every quiet glance, into every corner of the village where people used to gather. The once bustling square now stood empty, save for the soldiers on patrol, their faces hard and unreadable, their movements methodical. Anya could feel the tension rising in the air, like the stillness before a storm. The quiet was unbearable now, and yet no one seemed to know how to break it. No one knew how to speak of the things that were hanging in the balance. Her father had been right. They couldn't stay here much longer. But what was the alternative? There was no safe place anymore, no place untouched by the war. Her mother continued to go about her daily routine with her usual quiet determination. But Anya could see it in the lines of her face, the fatigue that was not just physical, but emotional. She had always been the strong one, the one who held the family together when times were tough. But now, there was a fragility to her strength, a hesitation in the way she moved, as if she were waiting for something to break. Anya's mind was heavy with the same questions, the same uncertainty that had been plaguing her since the soldiers first arrived. Where could they go? What could they do? She couldn't ignore it any longer. The world around her had already changed, and she couldn't just stand still and watch it pass her by. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in a soft, melancholic glow, Anya found herself standing at the edge of the field. The earth beneath her feet was hard and cracked from the summer heat, the once green crops now withered and dry. The sound of the river flowing nearby was the only thing that cut through the silence. It had always been a place of peace for her, but tonight, it felt more like an escape from the truth that was beginning to weigh her down. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see her father walking toward her, his face lined with concern. His gait was slow, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a burden that seemed to grow heavier each day. "Anya," he said quietly, stopping just a few feet away from her, "we need to talk." She nodded, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She had known this conversation was coming, but she wasn't ready for it. She wasn't ready to face the reality that their lives, everything they had known, was about to change in ways that couldn't be undone. "Father, what are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't just stand here, waiting for it to happen, waiting for everything to fall apart." Her father didn't immediately answer. He looked out over the fields, his eyes distant, as if searching for something in the horizon. When he spoke, his voice was soft but filled with a kind of sadness that Anya had never heard before. "I wish I could give you an answer, Anya," he said, his voice strained. "But there is no easy answer. The soldiers are here to stay. The war is coming closer, and we can't pretend it won't touch us." Anya felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, suffocating her. She had known this, but hearing it out loud made it real. There was no escaping it. The war was here, and it was only a matter of time before it came to them. "But we can't stay here," she said, the words coming out more firmly than she expected. "I can't stay here. I need to know what we're going to do, what our choices are." Her father turned to face her then, his eyes filled with something Anya couldn't quite place. For the first time, she saw the weariness in his face, the toll that the war had already taken on him. He had always been a man of few words, a man who carried the weight of the world without complaint. But now, in the fading light, he seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable. "There's a path, Anya," he said slowly, "but it's a dangerous one. There are no guarantees, no promises that we'll make it through, but it's the only choice we have left." Anya's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what he was talking about. "What path? What choice, father?" she said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" Her father stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. His touch was heavy with the weight of his own fear, but there was something else there, too, something like resolve. He was making a decision, one that would change everything. "We leave," he said simply. "We go south, towards the mountains. There are families there who've already fled. There are places we can hide, places where we can survive, but it's not safe. The roads are dangerous. The soldiers will be looking for people like us." Anya's breath caught in her throat. Leave, flee. The idea was so foreign to her, so unbelievable. How could they leave everything behind? The village, their home, the land that had sustained them for generations. She had never imagined leaving. But now, faced with the reality of what was happening, she knew it was the only choice. "What about the others?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What about the people here? The villagers?" Her father's face darkened at the question. He hesitated, and for a moment, Anya saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that looked like regret, or maybe sorrow. "They will have to make their own choices," he said quietly. "We can't save everyone, Anya. We can only save ourselves." The words stung, but Anya understood. She understood all too well. There was no time for hesitation, no time for sentiment. The world was falling apart, and the only thing they could do was survive. Her father turned, his eyes scanning the horizon one last time, before he began to walk toward the house. Anya stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just been said. She knew that when she crossed the threshold of their home that night, nothing would be the same. She was about to leave everything behind, but it was the only way forward, the only way to survive. She followed him, her steps slow, as though she were walking through a dream. There was no going back. The war was here, and they were running from it, just like everyone else who had ever had to leave everything they knew behind. But even as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that survival wasn't enough. Not anymore. There had to be something more than just surviving. There had to be something worth saving. The decision to leave had been made, but the journey ahead was one that no one could truly prepare for Anya and her family. The path south toward the mountains was not just a physical journey. It was the crossing of a line they had never imagined they would cross. They were leaving the place that had always been their home, the place that had cradled their lives and their memories, and stepping into an uncertain future that no one could predict. The village had become a place of quiet, constant surveillance. The soldiers moved through it like shadows, their presence both oppressive and unmistakable. They were everywhere now, their rifles slung across their backs, their eyes cold and watchful. The air, once filled with the sounds of daily life, had grown eerily silent. The familiar faces of the villagers, once filled with conversation and laughter, now held only hushed whispers and furtive glances. No one dared to speak freely anymore, not with the soldiers so close, listening for anything that might betray them. Anya could feel it in her bones. The village was no longer safe. The soldiers had begun to set up roadblocks, moving through the fields, searching for anyone who might be trying to escape. The once peaceful paths through the countryside were now filled with danger. Even the river, which had always been a place of solace and reflection, now seemed like a barrier, something that could separate them from everything they knew, but also something that could entrap them. It was late in the evening when Anya, her father, and her mother gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world shrouded in twilight. They had packed only the essentials, a few blankets, some dried food, and whatever little money they had managed to keep hidden. There was no room for anything else. They had no idea how long the journey would take, or what dangers awaited them. All they knew was that they had to leave. Now, they said nothing to the villagers, no goodbyes, no promises to return. It was as if, in that moment, the bonds that had tied them to the land, to the village, had snapped. They couldn't afford to draw attention to themselves. They couldn't afford to look back. Anya's mother took one last look around their small home, her gaze lingering on the place where they had spent so many years together, and then she turned and walked out the door, her shoulders tense with the weight of what they were about to do. Her father followed silently, his face a mask of determination, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. As they walked through the village square, Anya felt the weight of every step. The streets were empty now, the usual bustle of life replaced by an unsettling stillness. The once vibrant colors of the buildings, the flowers in the window boxes, the laughter of children, it was all gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. It was as though the village itself had become a ghost, its soul stolen by the shadow of the war that had already begun to consume it. They walked through the night, moving as quietly as possible, their steps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. The path toward the mountains was long and treacherous, but it was the only way forward. They couldn't stay in the village, not with the soldiers closing in. They had to make it to the mountains, to the families who had already fled, to the safety that lay beyond the reach of the war. As they reached the edge of the village, Anya turned for one last look. The houses, once filled with life, now stood dark and silent, like empty shells. It felt as though they were leaving behind not just a place, but a part of themselves. Everything they had known, everything they had worked for, was slipping away, and there was no way to hold on to it. Her father's voice broke through the silence, low and steady. "Keep moving. We don't stop until we're out of sight." Anya nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. There was nothing left to say. They could only keep moving, one step at a time, into the unknown. The journey south was harder than Anya could have ever imagined. The roads were no longer safe. The soldiers were everywhere, their patrols moving through the fields, searching for anyone trying to flee. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every sound a warning. The once beautiful landscape, the rolling hills and gentle rivers, now felt foreign, like a place that no longer belonged to them. Anya's father led the way, his steps sure but heavy. His experience with the land, with the rhythms of nature, kept him moving in the right direction, but it was clear that even he didn't know what lay ahead. There were no maps, no roads to follow, just the mountains in the distance, a vague promise of safety. Anya's mother kept to herself, her face pale and drawn, her thoughts obviously far from the present. She had always been the one to hold the family together, but now, even she seemed broken, as if the weight of the decision they had made had finally caught up with her. And Anya, she didn't know what to feel. Fear had become a constant companion, a tight knot in her stomach that only seemed to tighten as they walked. Her mind was filled with images of the village, of the people they had left behind, of the life they had abandoned. But there was no time to mourn. They had to survive. They had to reach the mountains, no matter the cost. After days of walking, the landscape began to change. The rolling hills gave way to rocky outcrops, the river narrowing as they climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew thin, and the cold began to seep into their bones. Every night, they huddled together under the blanket of stars, trying to sleep, trying to find comfort in the warmth of each other's presence. But sleep didn't come easily. Not when every rustle in the trees, every crack of a twig, felt like a threat. One night, as they camped near a small cave, Anya's father woke her in the middle of the night, his face drawn with fear. "They're coming," he whispered. "We have to move." Anya's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "Soldiers. They're close. We need to go now." They packed quickly, moving as quietly as possible, their hearts racing. The soldiers had found them, the war had caught up with them, and there was no more running, no more hiding. The night had fallen heavy, the darkness pressing in from all sides, broken only by the faint flicker of stars above. Anya's heart thudded in her chest, each beat a reminder of the fear that had become her constant companion. Her father's hurried whisper had sent her scrambling into the night, the cold biting at her skin as they packed their few belongings, their hearts racing with the urgency of their movement. Every second felt like an eternity, each footstep a calculated risk. As they moved further into the mountains, the terrain became more difficult. The path grew steeper, the rocks jagged and unforgiving. Their feet slipped on the loose gravel, and their legs burned from the strain of the climb. But Anya barely noticed the physical pain anymore. All she could think about was the sound of the soldiers' boots crunching on the earth, the way their voices had carried in the stillness of the night, cutting through the air like a blade. They were close, too close. Her father had known it was only a matter of time before the soldiers found them, but hearing their voices in the distance sent a chill through her that she couldn't shake. "Keep moving," her father said, his voice tight with the kind of urgency that made Anya's heart race even faster. "We can't afford to stop." Her mother, walking beside her, didn't say a word, but Anya could feel the weight of her mother's thoughts pressing on her shoulders. Her mother was always strong, always steady, but tonight she seemed as fragile as the crumbling rocks beneath their feet. Anya wanted to ask her if she was scared, but the question didn't need to be spoken. The fear was written in every line of her face, in the way her eyes flickered nervously at every rustle in the wind. They reached a narrow ledge that curved around a rocky outcrop, and her father motioned for them to stop. He crouched down, signaling for them to do the same. The wind howled around them, but there was no sound from the soldiers, no shouts, no commands. It was as if the world had gone still, as if everything had paused for a single moment before the storm broke. "Where are they?" Anya whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Her father's gaze was fixed on the darkened ridge ahead. His face was pale, his eyes narrow with concentration. "They're close," he said, his voice tense. "We have to be ready." Anya's breath hitched in her throat. She could hear the faint crunch of footsteps in the distance, and though they were still far away, the sound sent a wave of panic through her. The soldiers were coming. The soldiers were going to find them. She swallowed the lump in her throat and glanced at her mother, who was kneeling beside her, her face hidden behind the hood of her cloak. Anya could see her mother's hands trembling as she clutched the blanket they had brought with them. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, suffocating them. Anya's father slowly stood, his movements slow but deliberate. He turned to her mother and whispered something that Anya couldn't quite hear. Her mother nodded, though it was clear that she didn't understand how they were going to survive this. Anya's mind raced. The soldiers would find them. There was no escaping it. Her father had always been the one to keep them safe, to provide for them. But now, as the sound of the soldiers drew nearer, Anya could see the cracks in her father's resolve. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't immune to fear, and in this moment, she felt the weight of that fear more acutely than ever. A shout broke through the silence, distant but unmistakable. "There they are!" A voice rang out, echoing in the stillness of the mountains. "Hurry!" Her father's face hardened, and he turned to Anya, his eyes fierce with determination. "Go," he ordered. "We move now, before they get too close." Anya's body moved on instinct, her legs propelling her forward even as her mind screamed in protest. Her father led the way, moving quickly and silently. his eyes scanning the shadows, as if the very air around them could betray them. Her mother was right behind her, her footsteps steady despite the fear in her eyes. Anya wanted to scream, wanted to cry out, but the words lodged in her throat, choking her. There was no time for that now. They pushed forward, making their way through the narrow pass that wound between the jagged cliffs. The ground was uneven, and every step felt like it might be their last. The wind whipped at their faces, cutting through their clothes, but they couldn't stop. Not now, not when they were so close. The sound of the soldiers' voices grew louder, their footsteps drawing nearer, the urgency in their movements unmistakable. They were closing in. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of what was at stake. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The noise echoed in the mountains, a sound so sharp and sudden that Anya's heart skipped a beat. She froze, her body instinctively crouching low, her heart hammering in her chest. The soldiers had seen them. They had found them. Her father grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. "Keep moving," he hissed. "Don't stop." They ran, stumbling, through the jagged rocks, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Anya could hear the soldiers shouting behind them, their voices growing closer with every step. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, and she tripped, falling to her knees with a sharp cry. She looked up to see her father's outstretched hand reaching toward her, his face tight with fear and desperation. "Come on," he shouted, his voice strained. "We have to go." Anya took his hand and pulled herself to her feet, her legs shaking with exhaustion. The soldiers were almost upon them now. They had no choice but to keep running, to push forward into the unknown. But as they rounded a corner in the path, they found themselves face to face with a group of soldiers blocking the way. Anya's breath caught in her throat as she saw the guns in their hands, their eyes cold and unreadable. Her father stepped forward, his hand held out in a gesture of surrender. But his body was taut with readiness. "This is the end," Anya whispered to herself, her heart sinking. The soldiers advanced, and her father's grip tightened around her hand, his voice barely a whisper. "We fight for survival, Anya, no matter the cost." The standoff was brief, but it felt like a lifetime. Anya stood frozen, her body trembling, her mind caught in a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. The soldiers before them, 5 in total, were armed, their faces as cold and emotionless as the mountain air that whipped around them. They stood tall, their rifles slung across their backs, their eyes scanning the family before them with a calculating intensity. Anya's father was the first to break the silence. He stepped forward, his hand still gripping Anya's tightly, his face as stoic as he could make it, though his eyes betrayed the terror that had begun to consume him. He was no longer the strong, unwavering pillar he had once been. The weight of everything, the war, the decisions, the looming threat of death, had broken him in ways he couldn't hide. "Please," he said, his voice rough, his breath coming in sharp bursts. "We don't want trouble. We're just passing through. Let us go." The soldiers didn't respond at first. They simply stood there, watching the family with cold, indifferent eyes. One of them, the leader, the man with the scar running down his face, stepped forward. His eyes flicked to Anya's father, then to Anya herself, and finally to her mother, who had remained silent, standing behind her daughter. "I know what you're doing," the scarred man said in a voice that was calm, almost detached. "Trying to escape, trying to survive." He paused for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "But survival doesn't come easy." Anya felt the world close in around her. The air seemed to thicken, as though the very mountains themselves were holding their breath. The soldiers stood like an impenetrable wall, their gaze never wavering, their weapons a constant reminder of what stood between them and freedom. Her father's hand tightened around hers, but he didn't speak. What could he say? He had nothing left to offer them. No more pleas, no more bargains. Just his family, and their need to survive. "We'll do whatever it takes," Anya's father said, his voice suddenly fierce. "We'll work. We'll help. Just don't hurt us." The scarred man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Anya's father. There was a moment of silence, a heavy, suffocating moment, before he spoke again. "You think you can just run away?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "Do you think we'll let you? This isn't just about survival, it's about control. You've already chosen to run, to leave everything behind. You've chosen to defy us. And that is something we can't let go." Anya's chest tightened. The truth of the soldier's words struck her like a physical blow. They had left the village, yes, but they had left because staying meant death. They had left because there was nothing left for them but the promise of violence, the crushing weight of a war that had already stolen so much from them. And yet, here they were, still trapped in the same cycle of survival, still facing the same question: at what cost? The soldier's eyes flicked over Anya, lingering on her for a moment before he turned to his men. He nodded once, and the soldiers moved in unison, their boots crunching on the rocky ground. For a moment, Anya thought the worst was about to happen, that the soldiers would seize them, drag them away, and throw them into the darkness of the war that had already consumed so many others. But instead, the scarred man spoke again, his voice now oddly calm. "You can go," he said, his words cutting through the tension. "But know this, you won't find refuge. You won't find peace. The war is coming for all of you. And if you think you can outrun it, you're wrong." Anya felt a chill run down her spine. There was no mercy in the soldier's voice, no kindness in his eyes. He was telling them the truth, a truth that felt colder than the mountains themselves. The war would not let them escape. It would not let anyone escape. "Go," he said, stepping back. "But know this, you're already marked." With that, the soldiers turned and walked away, leaving Anya and her family standing there in the darkness, unsure of what to do next. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing and the wind rustling through the trees. Anya's father didn't move. He stood there, his face still pale, his body tense as if waiting for the soldiers to return, to change their minds. But they didn't. Single quotes. Her mother reached out, her hands trembling as she placed them on Anya's shoulders. She said nothing, but the weight of her touch spoke volumes. They were free for now, but freedom had come at a cost, and Anya knew that nothing would ever be the same again. They began to walk again, slowly, their movements heavy with the weight of everything they had just witnessed. The mountains seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them, their peaks lost in the mist, the path winding upward, each step a reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. As they moved through the rocky landscape, Anya's mind raced. The soldier's words echoed in her head. They were marked, there was no escaping it. They had made their choice to survive, to leave everything behind, and now they had to face the consequences. She glanced at her father, who walked ahead of them, his back bent under the weight of the decision he had made. His face was set in determination, but Anya could see the fear in his eyes. He was doing his best to lead them, to protect them, but she could see it in the way he moved, the way he held himself. He didn't know what would happen next. None of them did, but survival wasn't just about moving forward. It was about facing what was to come. The war had already taken everything, their home, their peace, their future, but Anya wasn't sure if survival alone would be enough. She wasn't sure if it ever would be. As the night stretched on, Anya couldn't help but wonder, would they survive? Would they ever find the refuge they were searching for, or would they always be running, always looking over their shoulders, always marked by the war that had consumed everything? She didn't know, and maybe that was the hardest part of all. But one thing was clear, they would never be the same, no matter where they went, no matter what they faced. The cost of survival had already been paid, and the price was more than they could ever have imagined.